What's up, friends? Hey, it's Ryan Coral, and you are listening to another edition of the Studio Sherpas podcast. Today, we are with Dr. Benjamin Hardy, who is an organizational psychologist and best-selling author of Willpower Doesn't Work, which was not my favorite, but one of my favorite books from last year. He's had over... Reading your bio, he's had over 100 million people read his blogs and was the #1 writer in the world on medium.com from 2015 to 2018. And then in 2019, I came in there and I just disrupted. No, I didn't do any of that.
I disappeared and I went and wrote 2 books.
No, that's what happens. Ben, hey, welcome to the show, man. Super glad that you're here.
Yeah, really great. Very happy to be with you, my friend.
So you were introduced to me by, are you familiar with EOS, the Entrepreneurial Operating System?
I do. Yeah, I know them quite well.
Yeah, so our implementer, Preston, we were doing kind of our yearly planning at the end of 2018 into the beginning of 2019. And he said, he gave us 2 books and your book was one of them. And so I quickly grabbed the Audible and listened to it and really was just blown away that the title Willpower Doesn't Work for me, you know, being a business owner for the last 16 years, I've had 3 significant moments in my business that have been very, very hard, right? Financially, just like in a spot of like, what are we doing? And for me, the first time that happened, I felt like all responsibility was on me. And I felt like the idea of like, you know, having to pull myself up by my bootstraps and like manufacture success is kind of this phrase that I held on to. And it was really, really hard. It was a hard mental space for me to feel like my employees, you know, their mortgages, their kids, their family, you know, all of this stuff, like it fell on me. And I just felt like, I was in this like constant battle of like trying to manufacture success. And I just loved some of the freedoms that came for me from Willpower Doesn't Work. I would love to just I would love to talk a little bit about that, but also
let's do it. I'd be happy to talk about
I'm excited to hear about your new book too. So
sure.
Give us a synopsis, just, you know, Willpower Doesn't Work. Like when you give your pitch for what that book is and why you wrote it, tell us.
Yeah. It's funny because I recently re-listened to the book, having since written 2 new ones. And, you know, obviously the main new one is this book right here, Personality. But I re-listened to it. And even though I love that book and there's a lot of things I love in it, I'm not the same human being who actually wrote that book. I wrote that 3 years ago. And so I'm like, wow, I wouldn't write that book today. No, but I do love what I do. I do love a lot about it. I think that's actually a fun part of creativity. Is kind of seeing yourself change. And one of my favorite quotes is actually that if you're not embarrassed by who you were 12 months ago, you didn't learn enough. But anyways,
I love that.
Why did I write Willpower Doesn't Work? There's a few reasons why I wrote the book. One is I have a younger brother who I love, and he has more, let's just say, charisma and talent than 95% of people who are born, and he just can't move his life forward at all. Obviously, addiction is a big thing. I grew up in a huge addiction environment, and you obviously can't. It's not recommended to try to overcome an addiction through willpower. Let's just say that. Very non-effective approach.
Right.
And my brother is just so great, but he won't break through. And I wanted to write about why. And for me, obviously a big part of it is that he puts all the pressure on himself to do it. He doesn't change his environment, doesn't change his context. The other thing that really pushed me over the edge, though, so let's just say I wrote the book to my brother, you know, because I think when you write a book, you write it to an audience, you know, but I wrote the thing that pushed me over the edge, aside from my background in psychology, was when we became the foster parent of our 3 kids. You know, so like really interesting to see what happens to a person when you take them from a really limiting context or really limiting environment and watch what can happen. Because our 3 kids, they came from the middle of nowhere in South Carolina, and basically their parents, they got put in the foster system for a reason. You know, like their parents were on drugs and neglecting them. They weren't going to school. They were just staring at TV. And so, I mean, the book's really about how your potential is shaped by your context or your environment. And, you know, just as an example, if you and I were living 150 years ago, we wouldn't be able to have this conversation on Zoom. No amount of willpower would have allowed us to have this conversation. And so our kids not only changed when we put them in this new environment where all of a sudden they've got access to like school, tutors, sports, friends. We travel with them and expose them to new things. Obviously our environment's not perfect, but they changed a lot because they had new capacity and new opportunities. And we changed a lot. Like when we took on these 3 kids, all of a sudden there's a quote from William Durant, who's the famous historian, but he says the ability of the average person could be doubled if their situation demanded it, So it's like, I wanted to write a book about how context matters more than willpower, like your context, your situation, and about how you could proactively and should proactively create situations that force the best out of you. And so rather than focusing on all yourself, it's about focusing on the context and creating situations that force you to do far more than you could ever do by yourself. So that's really what the book's about.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if it's small or not. I don't, for me, it's not small, but like one of the small changes that I made through listening to that book is like, I started deleting apps from my phone, Facebook, Instagram. Now, granted, I've gone through seasons where I've added them back. But even this week, not thinking about this conversation at all, where I was like, I'm going to delete them so I can tell Ben that I did that. But it's like I've had time working from home. I should have more time because I'm not driving my kids to school, and I just have like more availability. I'm working at home in the basement, and I've found myself up in the morning and I'm like scrolling through news and, read the news now. It's like endless. I mean, it's always endless, but it's just not good. There's nothing good about it. And I found myself like some mornings dragging, and I'm not a person that drags in the morning. I'm a person that like, I get up,
you get moving.
Once I'm up, I'm moving. But I've just been spending longer reading news, scrolling through Facebook, and I'm like, what the heck? And so on Sunday, I figured out how to block the news site from my Chrome app on my phone, so I can't go to it anymore on my phone. And I deleted Facebook, I deleted my LinkedIn app, and a game, and and I'm like, I'm excited to see what my weekly report is this weekend. I've been turning my phone off or leaving it in the office after I leave work. And this week has just been awesome. And so much of that is based around your idea of environments. Like as you can think about, you can control to some extent the environment. And for me, a time suck and an energy suck for me was this environment of like, hey, these apps are just readily available. These sites are like right here, so I can just go to them, I can do the thing, and I can waste time. And really what I'm doing is I'm just wasting away.
Yeah. I'll share with you a thought that was not as clearly developed in Willpower Doesn't Work, although it is the idea. So what you're describing is you make one decision, you remove the app, and then you don't have to think about it anymore. That's so in psychology, another term for willpower or another explanation is called decision fatigue. And basically it's the idea that if you have to keep, the more decisions you have to make, the worse those decisions become. There's also a really good book called The Paradox of Choice. And it's basically the idea that there's such an extensive amount of options in the world today. And most of them are distractions, like all the news sites and things like that. So, one of the core principles is obviously for environment design is strategic ignorance. Like literally, your input shapes your outlook. And so the more things that you let in, for example, news feeds and things like that, those things mess with your creative process. They mess with your mind because they go into your head. And so you're better off creating an environment where you're strategically ignorant of many things. But when it comes to making a decision, so check this out. You'll like this because it has to do with apps. And I really wish I would have developed it better in Willpower, but you learn, a painting is never finished. A painting is never finished. It just ends in an interesting place is kind of how you look at art. But there's a quote. So there's a quote from Clayton Christensen. I don't know if you know who he is, but he's dead now, but he was a very important business professor at Harvard. And he had a saying that basically said 100% commitment is easier than 98% commitment. 100% is easier than 98. And the reason why makes a lot of sense when you actually like study the concept of willpower. Because put it this way, I'll give an example. Like, let's just say you're going to go on a diet and you're 98% committed to that diet. Just, the problem with 98% commitment in this case is that you haven't actually made a decision you've sort of made a decision. And the problem with that is this, that in every future situation you're in, you don't actually know what the outcome's going to be. You don't know if you go to a party and you don't know if in that situation you're going to eat the dessert because you haven't made the decision. You've put yourself in a situation where in the situation you have to make a decision. And that's what they call decision fatigue, where you're in situations where you have to make a decision in the moment, and usually the situation wins. That's, usually the environment wins. Usually your willpower is not enough. And so you don't want to put yourself in situations where you don't know the outcome. It's a lot better. So Michael Jordan said this. He said, once I made a decision, I never thought about it again. Yeah. And so if you're 100% committed, then you don't have to make decisions and deal with decision fatigue. You can stop thinking about it. But then obviously then you need to design. You need to design around the decision. But you want to avoid decision fatigue. Let's just say that, as an entrepreneur as well, you want to avoid making as many decisions as possible. You want to either outsource them, eliminate them, delegate them, so that you only have to make a few decisions.
Oh man, that's really, really good.
You don't want to be 98% committed to something. Let's just say that.
Yeah. No,
you don't want to be in a situation where you don't know where the outcome's going to be. Situation will win. Let's just say that. Willpower will fail you.
When you say that, I'm thinking about it. I'm like, oh yeah, those are all of the things that's why I didn't do that thing. That's why I didn't, because I was not 100% in. And I
well, that's why removing the app is so great, because you remove the app once, and obviously you can put it back on. But if you remove the app once, it's one decision, so you don't have to keep thinking about it. If it's still there, you'll think about it, That's why you want to remove things from your environment, because you don't want to have to keep thinking about it. I mean, you want to free your mind for better things. I mean, that's one of the things that is the inherent nature of addiction, is that you're still thinking about it. The addiction's gone when you've stopped thinking about it.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm thinking about at 9:00 at night when the kids are down and my wife and I are going to watch a show, and I'm like, I'll just grab a bowl of cereal. But I'm like, wait, no, I already decided that I wasn't going to eat after 8:30 or whatever. But I'm like, I mean, it's just, I don't know.
Tell her that you don't want to do it. And my wife holds me more, sometimes the idea is outsourcing your accountability and outsourcing your motivation to your environment, because you know that you're weak, we have weak willpower. And so, my wife holds me more accountable to my goals often than I do, and it's great to have a supportive environment where there's people, your wife probably doesn't care if you eat cereal or not, right? But if you don't want to, and you tell her, I really don't want to do this, and so if I'm about to go eat cereal, tell me not to, it's good to have those reminders. I mean, it's actually good to design an environment that supports your future self rather than your former self, so, it's good to have those positive triggers versus just a bunch of negative ones.
Yeah. I love that, the idea of designing your environment. And so you have to, consciously make a decision and say okay, what could it look like, and what could life look like? And that forces you to make some strategic decisions versus just finding yourself in that situation or in that environment and responding, usually not in the way that you want to. That's good. Yeah. So in the book, I know one of the takeaways, a big challenge for creatives is getting stuck and not feeling creative, feeling like there's writer's block or creative block. As a filmmaker, we want to create great stuff. We want to create stuff that inspires our clients and impacts the world. But there are plenty of times where we might get stuck and frustrated. How do you speak into being able to design or create a better spot to be able to be creative and to maybe hit less roadblocks along the way?
Yeah, for me, I definitely prefer creating without distractions. I think that probably is true of a lot of people.
Yeah.
And so for me, that has a lot to do with timing. In the case of myself with 5 kids, that probably means it's going to be in the morning. You know what I mean? Before they're awake. So I wake up at 5 a.m. or even sometimes 4. Today I got up even earlier because I'm working on a lot of things. And I at this point now, I'm not actually at my house. I have a separate house that's 10, 15 minutes away. That's just an office essentially. So I do have a space that I can go away from. But even for years when I didn't, I would wake up early. For me, I do love the concept of eat the frog, do the worst first.
Yep.
I even noticed this with my kids, because we're doing homeschool, there's certain things that there's certain aspects of the schooling that they love doing and there's certain aspects that they hate doing.
Yep.
And if they leave the worst thing to the last, their whole day sucks because the whole day they're procrastinating and dreading doing the thing that they wanted. But if they just did that first, and so we've been training them to do the worst first. And so like lately, you know, our 12-year-old, he's been doing this thing that is his least favorite aspect of homeschool. He's been doing it first, and the rest of his day is amazing because he no longer has to think about, again, with that whole idea of thinking about, he no longer has to dread doing that thing. And I think that that's a big aspect of creativity, is dreading, you know, whatever it is you ultimately want to do. In this case, it's not homeschool. It's like, for me, it could be writing the blog post and like dreading getting myself to do it. But the longer I wait to do it, the worse my day becomes. And literally it feels like a failure until I, and so for me, first off, just as far as kind of mindfulness and environment, I love waking up and getting myself out of my environment, because when you switch environments, you become a lot more mindful. And so even if for me, that could just be stepping out into my car. I've done a lot of journaling in my car, but I love waking up, journaling, getting myself reframed towards my future self and just thinking about my goals and getting myself into a right frame of mind. It could be meditation. It could be prayer. You know, I love getting my mind going, you know, just like drinking a bunch of water, taking supplements, and like just getting my mind going, and then just journaling. And, you know, I think, like we've been watching like master classes, you know, like the master class videos. So we've been watching Steph Curry's master class. And it's interesting how Steph Curry does a warm-up routine every time he shoots. So like Steph, and it's so funny because like I used to play a lot of basketball, and I see a lot of people who play basketball and they don't practice like Steph Curry. Like Steph Curry, literally the first thing he does before he starts shooting his 1,000 3-pointers, which he's so good at, he literally goes right next to the hoop and he shoots 5 shots, literally right next to the hoop, until he makes 5. And then he steps back like literally like 2 feet, shoots 5 shots until he makes it, steps to the free throw line, shoots 5 shots. And then he shoots steps. And so he's made like 100 shots before he goes to the 3. And if you think about it from a confidence perspective, you want to get some small wins. And so that like, once you actually start the training, you're flowing. And so I think that for me, that's why I journal, is because I journal and I just get my mind going. And then, you know, I start thinking of ideas for articles, or I think about things I need to do today, people I need to reach out to. And so I think that doing that kind of stuff in a good distraction-free environment before you've gotten all the inputs that mess up your mind, you know, as far as your social media and stuff, like once you start putting different inputs in your head, immediately your ability to focus dissipates, you know, it just goes away, because even if you try to focus, your brain starts working on the things that you give it. And so even if you're just throwing inputs in, could be social media, you can try to focus back in, and you can do it, but your brain's going to be increasingly scrambled eggs. And so it's just, for me, it's so good in the morning to just wake up, get myself into a clear environment, get myself into the right frame of mind, and start myself on kind of that Curry session, you know, where I'm just writing and thinking and framing my future self and getting my creative juices going. And, you know, for me, I do pray. You know, I'm a spiritual person, and I pray and I meditate beforehand so that I can get inspiration in that moment. But that's where I usually get my ideas, you know, when I'm thinking about my future self. And that's where I think about, what do I want to write about today, you know, or who do I need to reach out to? And that's how I live intentionally. And so I think that's big for me when I think about environment design.
Yeah, that's really powerful. Just that idea of like, once you start, whether it's checking your email, hopping on social media,
speeds your brain up, man.
Yeah, it speeds your brain up. And that's just that idea of distraction. It's like so obvious of like, oh, of course, like you're letting in more inputs. So it's your mind just starts to like go in a bunch of different directions. And if you need focus and you need clarity for an idea or a thing that you're wanting to do, to be able to tackle it, you know, we do a practice with our team where in the morning we'll meet at like 9:40 for our daily huddle. And we'll just, one of the 3 questions is like, what's your one thing that you want to get done before the end of the day?
Genius.
Yesterday morning, I'm patting myself on the back. Yesterday morning, I actually did the 3 things that I set out for the day. I did those before our huddle yesterday. So I got to the huddle and I just said, guys, I'm done for the day. I'm going to call it quits. I did not call it quits, but that idea, when I can do the worst first, it's like, I did those things and I'm like, all right, well, anything else I do today is just like icing on the cake. Most days are not like that. Most days I'm not doing the worst first, but when I do, you're totally right. It's like, it's the best. And so one of the things that I'm trying to do And because I'm making it public, it's holding me accountable.
Do it. Make it public, baby.
I am, we have a YouTube channel where we post the podcast episodes, but for me, there's no extra work in that. It's like, we do this here and it's like easy peasy. Team gets it online. But what I'm wanting to do is to create shorter 5-10 minutes sort of, inspirational, encouraging, challenging pieces that might be related to the podcast, but it's not the podcast. So it's a video that I actually have to think consciously, like, what do I want to help? What do I want to create in doing it? So even just in this conversation, I'm like, I need to do that like first thing in the morning, because I haven't done them. I've done one. I've got one under my belt, but it's like a week and a half have gone by, and I'm still like, what's the perfect idea? What should I do? And I just need to do it. And the further in the day I get, the less I'm just like, I just don't have the energy. And I think part of it is because I'm just everywhere. I've done so many different things. I've had so many different conversations. My focus is all over the place. If it is like one of the first things that I do when I come down to the office, like I would totally be able to knock that thing out.
Yeah, I love it. And, if you just sat with your journal in the morning before so distracted or so just spread and just wrote about all the ideas that you want to make up a 5-minute video. My guess is that with the access to the right part of your brain or your mind, you have dozens and dozens of ideas that will easily be these 5-minute videos.
Yeah.
Ideas from books you've read or just lessons you've learned or even from the podcast or whatever it is. There are dozens of videos that you already kind of know that are going to be the ones you're going to be creating.
Yeah.
It's just writing them all down and then just knocking them out, obviously one at a time. I have got whiteboards in my other room, and since I'm now getting back into blogging, I've got just a list of just garbage ideas that I'm going to be writing blog posts on. And what's great is that you can talk about things you've talked about in the past. You can repurpose ideas. I mean, I'm going to go back through this blogging phase now that I'm out of the cave essentially and writing again. And a lot of the stuff's repeat from stuff I've said in the past, maybe in different ways, but it just doesn't even matter, just as long as you're creating.
Yeah, that's really good. That's really freeing. Cause I think as creatives, like there's this, like, I think this unwritten rule of like, no, it always has to be new. Like, don't go back. I love that. I also love that quote you brought up. I actually wrote this down, and then you said it. Anyone who isn't embarrassed of who they were last year probably isn't learning enough. And I think that goes with, creating videos. It's like, I just remember, especially early on, 3 months after or a month after creating something and posting it, and then 6 months and a year looking back at that stuff, it just was like, it got worse and worse and worse. Like, I can't believe the client actually liked that video. But it's, it totally relates to that whole idea that if you're not creating or trying to, be better, trying to create something better, new, different, whatever, and you're not hating, what you did 6 months ago, there's probably a disconnect there.
You're not actively and progressively learning. I mean, this is one of the core concepts in personality isn't permanent. And there's a lot of good research on identity, but you see the world not as it is, but as you are, and your current self is different from your former self. Even a year ago, what you thought was good a year ago is not what you think is now. Right. Is all you got to do is go back and watch your former self on film. And you're like, oh gosh, that's not me anymore. You know what I mean? So I love it. I go back and even me with Willpower. I mean, I read it and I wrote that 3 years ago. And I'm like, holy cow, I'm not that guy anymore. Sometimes I'm embarrassed looking at some of my old blog posts, but what's funny is that those blog posts did great for me back then, and you got to realize that your current context is different than your former context. How you see the world now, how, what you're working towards, how you view business, you've got a different level of confidence and capability and perspective over the last year of growth, that your view of excellence or your view of how to serve a client or your view of how to communicate should be different.
Right.
And so what's really cool about that, and it's one of the reasons why you shouldn't overly value your current perspective. It's one of the reasons why having labels for yourself is really limiting, is because your future self is actually just as different from who you are today as your former self is from who you are today. Your future self is going to be embarrassed of who you are today.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Which is great because right now what the biggest mistake people make is that they think that their current self is the finished product.
Yeah.
So there's actually a quote so there's a really good TED talk I recommend your listeners listen to. It's called The Psychology of Your Future Self. And this is from Daniel Gilbert. He's a Harvard psychologist. He studied personality development over time. And he's got a really good quote. He basically says that human beings are works in progress that mistakenly think they're finished. Once you actually realize that personality develops over time, and actually if you're aggressive towards a future self, it becomes really fascinating when you hear people be so definitive about their current self. I am X. It's because it's like, in a year from now, you're gonna be embarrassed about X, but because people hold so tightly to various identities, labels, or statuses, they actually stunt their growth and development. They become far more inflexible and less imaginative, less creative, less courageous towards working towards a future self that's beyond their current self. And instead, everything they do is to confirm their current label or their current status or identity. Mm-hmm. And so, the future isn't that exciting if all you're doing is trying to confirm who you currently are. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, that's really good. Where did the idea, like, what was the thing that made you think like, this is it, this needs to be a book?
A few things. This is obviously a much different book than Willpower, but a few things led to it. One is, obviously I'm a big believer in change, transformation, and kind of pop culture ideas around personality is that it's innate. It's not changeable. You can't change it very much. I had a lot of conversations even with psychologists, and a lot of them thought the same thing, that your personality is kind of innate. Like if you're an introvert, you'll always be an introvert. You can maybe make a little progress. I just didn't really like that idea because it's not true of my experience. And it's also just like, in digging into the research, it's not true of really how personality works. So that was one thing, was just kind of trying to understand, why do people think this thing doesn't change? Why do people think that this thing is innate and flexible when it's really not? But there's a few other things that were very pivotal. One was obviously learning about what's called psychometrics in psychology, which is basically how tests are developed and validated. And just all of my professors over and over again were talking about tests like Myers-Briggs and Enneagram, like any type-based test. They're just not good science, and just explaining the whys as far as why they're bad tests and why you shouldn't take them seriously. That was really interesting. But the main thing that honestly shoved me over the edge was in 2018, I read the book, The Body Keeps the Score. I don't know if you've ever heard of that book. Mm-mm. The Body Keeps the Score is kind of the definitive book on trauma. It's written by a psychiatrist named Bessel van der Kolk. And that book goes deep into how trauma shapes people. Obviously, and I'm talking like emotional traumas, could be, the thing about trauma though is it's not exactly as you think. Yes, it could be being sexually abused or it could be going to war, but there's little things that are traumatic. Like there's even a lot of research on what's called math trauma, where you fail a math test and you all of a sudden develop this fixed mindset that you can't do math anymore. Actually, like most kids in America have math trauma and therefore a fixed mindset around math. And so what van der Kolk talks about is that trauma freezes your personality, where you get stuck in the past. And then basically what happens is that your personality becomes a coping mechanism, where you're avoiding the trauma and you're living a repetitive cycle and you're not dealing with the trauma. And so your personality stops developing. Your emotional development stops developing, and you become very rigid emotionally. You become very black and white in your thinking. You have a fixed mindset, and you become inflexible. And so basically one of the other things he said is that trauma shatters flexibility and imagination. And what's interesting is that those are the two things that are required for learning. Like you can't learn something if you don't have imagination, and if you're not flexible to figuring out new ways of seeing things. That's how you learn.
Right.
And so trauma literally stops you from learning. And so that was one of the key things that I'm like, okay, this is one of the reasons why people are the way they are. And obviously there's many others, but obviously environment being one. Environment's one of the big things that keeps people repetitive in their peer groups and their roles. But I just wanted to explain to people how personality really works, that it is very flexible, that it is something that changes and adapts and evolves over time, whether you try to or not. And that there are certain things that are leading you to being stuck that if you adjust, you can change radically. So that was kind of just my intentions behind this book.
I love it. It's so funny because one of my questions I wanted to talk about, I remember the first time I ever took a personality test, we did Myers-Briggs. Andrew and I did that when we were doing premarital counseling and stuff. And it was like, we're reading this stuff and we're like, oh my gosh, that's hilarious. And one of the things was like, hey, you guys will be served well because our personalities are very similar. One of the things was like, you guys would be served very well if like you hire a housekeeper, which we thought was hilarious because we were like totally broke and, whatever back in the day. But, 15 years later, when we hired a housekeeper, we're like, oh my gosh, this is one of the best things for our marriage.
We should have done that 15 years ago.
Right. Exactly. But we've done, strength finders and obviously most recently the Enneagram. And for me, every time, and I don't know if it's just the way that my personality is, I always pull the things where I'm like, yeah, this is, and I don't do horoscopes or anything like that, but I know I can read a horoscope and be like, oh, I could see how that could apply to anybody whenever they're born or whatever. I don't know if it's because I'm optimistic or whatever the thing is inside of me, but they're like reading my Enneagram. I'm like, man, that's so interesting. And strength finders for me, I'm like, oh, I can see how I can leverage these strengths that I have. I never really labeled them, but now that I kind of know, how they can serve people, like I could leverage them in, use them as a superpower. So I'm just curious, I know part of your stance is like, well, from a scientific, and I had a consultant one time, she was like, do not do these personality tests. Like they don't define you. And she was very adamant about it. I'm like, I know, but I feel like
you can obviously get some good insight from them. You can get some good insight from them. And I think that's what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And I think that there are tools that can provide insight. I think that you can also get I'm guessing that everything you've ever learned from the Strength Finder, you could have learned in other ways.
Yeah.
I'm guessing that, like, for example, I took the Strength Finder because someone really wanted me to, so I'm guessing that the person who shared with you the book, I think it was Peter, you said, who went from EOS.
That was Preston.
Preston.
Yep.
I'm guessing he may or may not be in Strategic Coach, which is, have you heard of Strategic Coach?
I have. Yeah. Is that Dan Miller?
Dan Sullivan.
Dan Sullivan. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. So Dan Sullivan, he and I actually co-authored a book that's coming out in October called Who Not How, which is purely
cool.
But EOS and Strategic Coach are really aligned. The only
he's a part of that world.
Well, yeah, because Dan shared Willpower Doesn't Work with everyone in Strategic Coach, and so I think that's how it trickled. The only reason I bring that up is because Strategic Coach is really big on personality profiling. I mean, all of them, and I'm obviously not. But they had me take Strengths Finder, and I. First off, I will say an important aspect of all this is that you wouldn't have gotten the same scores 10 years ago as you got now. Right. My guess is personality. My guess is that if you and your wife retook the personality tests that you took 15 years ago, you'd get very different scores now.
Totally.
That's very normal, very healthy, actually. One interesting thing is that if you had taken the test for a different reason, not for the purpose of marriage, you actually would have scored the test differently as well. So like your score on those tests was relevant to the context. You were taking it together. If you guys hadn't taken it together, you would have gotten slightly different scores, not radically different.
Yeah, sure.
But even just you two taking the tests together again, your tests are actually going to be more similar to what they were than they would be if you weren't taking them together. There's so many reasons why. But anyways, going back to StrengthsFinder, I went through it and I took it. And the thing about it is you answer it a certain way, right? You answer it based on your own perspectives. And so I answered it based on the perspectives of my current self. And like, I got like learner and all these things. And they're the things that I've sought for specifically for the last 10 years. Like they're the very attributes that I've been seeking to strengthen. Right. And so my strengths are not innate. They're the strengths that I've literally wanted the last 10 years.
Yeah.
And so when it spelled it out to me, I'm like, yeah, of course these are my strengths. Right. Like these are the things that I've been focusing on for the last 10 years.
Yep.
But they were definitely not strengths 10 years ago. So I don't know, but I think that you can definitely use them. I would say that there are upsides if you're a flexible thinker and if you take them with a grain of salt, and there are huge downsides if you take them too seriously, as far as creating a fixed identity, a fixed mindset, and not being flexible to choosing different strengths, So that's my take.
I love that. Yeah, I appreciate that perspective. That's definitely a healthy, probably the healthiest way to look at those. Knowing the current status that we're in, my tribe of filmmakers and business owners, it's a struggle right now for a lot of people. I mean, most any of us can't film anything, right? At least,
Richard Branson said something pretty funny. He said, if you want to, did you read what he said about being an airline pilot?
No.
Richard Branson said, if you want to be a millionaire, start as a billionaire and start an airline. If you want to be a millionaire, start as a billionaire and start an airline, because of obviously what's going on with COVID right now. You know what I mean?
So my question is, like, you know, as we try to have healthy headspace and try to, you know, there's probably a million things that people are thinking and wondering, you know, well, if I only did this, I'd be in a different spot. Either, you know, I didn't save enough money to plan for, you know, not having work for 2 months, or, you know, whatever those messages are. Like, what things, how would you encourage us as a community of business owners and video people? How would you encourage us in this time where it's like, it's pretty tough? And I'll just leave it at that. How would you speak some life, speak some courage, some truth to us?
Okay, I'll try my best. So there's two questions that I've asked my audience recently, and they've really loved them. And one of them is, obviously there's things that we could have all done better before this event, which none of us anticipated. But it's really good to actually ask yourself, what are the things that you were glad you did do? What are the things that the decisions you're glad you did make, or the decisions you're glad you did, or the things you were glad you were doing before you could have ever expected this to happen, that now are making your life much better than if you hadn't been doing those things. Just thinking about the decisions you had made, or the investments you had made, or, and those don't have to all be financial investments. I mean, I was thinking about all the time I'd spent, like, in some of my more spiritual practices. And I'm like, wow, like, I'm really glad I was doing those things before COVID-19. Yeah. And what's really interesting, so obviously this is kind of measuring what's called the gain, like focusing on, like, obviously reframing the past in a more positive way, and like being grateful for the things you were doing. But what's interesting is that, like, so there's a lot of, in my opinion, really bad advice. So a lot of bad advice about how to be present. And, you know, a lot of people say the past doesn't matter and the future doesn't exist, and so all you have is right now. I actually think that that's some of the most thoughtless advice I've ever heard. First off, you can't actually live in the present without a past. Like, if I didn't have a memory, I wouldn't even know you're a human. You know what I mean? Yeah. And obviously our past shapes ourselves, but also I like the quote from Dan Sullivan. He says, the bigger your future, the better your present. And what he means by that is so what a lot of the research has shown on future self is that without a clear future self, without knowing who you want to be, and by the way, it's a decision. You don't discover who you want to be, you decide who you want to be. Yeah, without actually clarifying and deciding that, you actually can't make clear decisions today. Like, if I don't know who I want to be, then it doesn't matter what I do today, right? And so you can't know your current identity, and you can't live presently without knowing what your future is. It's impossible to make high quality decisions in the present if you don't know where you want to go in the future. And so, you know, when you're in a state of preparation for something, that's the best way to be living presently, is preparing and anticipating. It doesn't have to necessarily be for COVID-19. You could be obviously preparing for a positive reality, but it's literally, when you're in a state of preparation, you're actually living presently. You're preparing for a big future. And that doesn't mean you're not living. But also in psychology, there's a concept called implementation intentions. And so obviously you want to be preparing and planning for the future that you want, but also you want to be preparing and planning for unforeseen incidences, failures, or obstacles along the way. We call that implementation intentions. And I think this could be a good opportunity to learn from this experience, because this experience is one of two things. It's either happening to you or it's happening for you. Yeah, that's good. You get to frame it in one way or the other. Either this is happening to you or for you. And I understand that there's a lot of negative situations that are happening, but it is happening, and you can either learn from it or you can be crippled by it. Yeah. If it is happening for you, though, and if you're learning from this, then you can then become radically better prepared in the future. And that's what a lot of people will do. Yeah. A lot of people will take this and they will be better as a result. They'll be better prepared for future situations that they can't predict. The other question, though, that I asked people that was really hopeful and helpful. And by the way, what's really interesting about hope is that you can't have motivation without hope. Like, motivation is impossible without hope. And hope is obviously a very positive expectation that something could happen, and that there's a path towards your goal, and that you have some agency in the matter. And so motivation and hope are really important, and they require a future. But the question that I had for people was, how is your future self helping you get beyond COVID-19? And I think that it's really important to clarify who you want to be and not be so caught up in this current situation. Because yeah, it's easy to be distracted. It's easy to get caught up in the noise, but there's also a lot of people who are not distracted. And there's a lot of people who are not caught up in the noise because they're still working towards their future self.
Yeah.
And part of being adaptable. So like Charles Darwin, and this is, I think this was in Willpower Doesn't Work. You know, a big aspect of Willpower Doesn't Work is about adaptability, adapting to new environments. Charles Darwin, and he was talking about evolution, but he said, it's not the strongest or the smartest of species that wins. It's those that are the most adaptable to change. And I think that when you're in a state of preparation, when you're kind of becoming increasingly flexible, then you can handle these types of situations. Not to say that they're easy. Nothing like this is easy.
Right.
Going from 0 to 5 kids is not easy. It's not fun. You know what I mean? Like even having your business fail, if it fails, that's not cool. And I'm not saying that I'm not downplaying the negatives that happen to all of us. But what I'm saying is either you're going to be adaptable to this environment and you're going to become better, or you're going to snap. It's the idea that pressure can either bust pipes or make a diamond, you know? And so if you can be flexible and adaptable in this situation, then when it goes away, you're going to be even better. It's kind of like when baseball players are freaking practicing with 3 bats, getting stronger, you know, and then when they get up to plate, it's freaking 1 bat. I just think right now we're holding 3 bats.
Yeah.
And so you can either get really strong during the situation or you can become weaker.
I love that, man. That's powerful. That's really good. Good job.
One last thought though, is that right now more than ever, the things like morning routines and journaling and clarifying your future self and strategic ignorance and all the things we've talked about in this environment, you know, decision versus decision fatigue, being 100% versus 98%, everything we've talked about today, I would say matters 10x in this environment where there's increasing complexity and increasing uncertainty. It is so much harder for people now without a clear purpose and without commitment and without routines to give themselves intention to have the fog would be endless. And so that's why I think the morning routines and like clarifying your future self and making progress towards your big 3, the worst first. If you get caught in the media, your brain will be fried all day and you'll get caught in the anxiety and the fear and the confusion of what the situation is. None of us know what this situation is. This is new for all of us. Right. And unless you're the doctor solving this problem, which I don't think any of your photographers are, you can't really stress that much about COVID-19 because, I mean, there's certain things you can do within your frame or within your realm, but to sit and stress about it for too long is only going to destroy your confidence, your clarity, your purpose, and your motivation. And so this is why I think the strategic ignorance and maybe, I mean, you can give yourself rules when you'll study or when you'll just zone into the media world. You know, I prefer not to read that stuff, although I have plenty of people who tell me about it, but I have my own vices. You know, I like watching sports on ESPN on YouTube. You know, I'll listen to some absurd commentary, but I don't do any of that stuff until after I've done the worst first, you know, and like after I've done those big 3, like you're saying. So I would just recommend that.
That's awesome. Ben, this is super good. I'm sad that we had to be done, but how can people keep up with what you got going on? Are you spending time back on Medium? Is that where can people find you? How can they get your book, all that stuff?
Yeah. So the book's called Personality Isn't Permanent. Although we've spent most of our time talking about Willpower Doesn't Work, I think that this book is, from my perspective, from the perspective of Benjamin Hardy, as of today, this is the one I would recommend more. Although, obviously, this Benjamin Hardy is different from you. So, you know, it's great about that. But yeah, I would say you can get the book anywhere. Obviously, Willpower Doesn't Work is there as well. So you can get the book anywhere, Audible, Amazon, Kindle. If you want to get in touch, just benjaminhardy.com. You can email me from there. And if you buy the book, we give away a bunch of free goodies, you know, as far as there's 3 courses we give away: a deep dive into personality isn't permanent. There's a journal mastery course, which over 10,000 people have bought. It's a great course on just using your journal. Honestly, how to use it, where to use it, how to reframe your past, how to upgrade your subconscious. And then the final thing is I give away a blogging course, which we've sold for over $1,000 many a time, which was actually filmed at Genius Network. It was a full day event. And that deep dives everything I did to get over 400,000 email subscribers through blogging without paid ads. And so those are all just things we give away for free for buying the book. Far more important to me though is that you buy the book, because I think it will really help you understand the traumas that have shaped you, help you reframe the past, and help you ultimately to clarify your future self and make that the thing driving you versus your past to drive you. And I think it'll help you in your business. It'll help you in your relationships. So yeah, I'm just honored that I got to be on your show, man. It was fun.
Oh my gosh, you're serious? This is what a treat. Super grateful for the work that you're doing, and
Thanks, man.
Just love the power in your voice, and just the way you're being used. Really good stuff.
Thanks, man.
Thank you for having the confidence to just commit to writing and contributing, making it public, sharing it. That's really good. I think it takes a lot of guts, and thankful that you did that. So thanks for being here.
I'll add one thing just because of what you just said.
Yeah.
So there's a theory called identity, the theory of narrative identity, but it's basically the idea that our identity is shaped by the stories we tell about ourselves. Most people they've told the same story for far too long. I'm X. Here's my invitation to myself and to my readers, and you've actually exercised this idea a few times in this episode. When you've clarified your future self, so the idea is that the number one deathbed regret for people is that they didn't have the courage to be who they wanted to be, but instead they lived up to the expectations of those around them. When you take the time to actually clarify the future self that you really want to be, the next step is honestly to tell everyone about that new self, to tell everyone about your goals, and to acknowledge that you're not there yet, but that this is who I'm striving to be. Yeah. That is the only way to actually be authentic. And it's the only way to actually because you're now being honest about who you're wanting to be.
Yeah.
And when you start telling everyone about who you want to be, not only do you create an environment of obviously accountability, but then you feel more compelled to do it. And it does take guts, it takes guts to write blog posts. It takes guts to do creative work. It also takes a lot of guts to tell people who you want to be, and to tell people about your future self, and to tell people about your goals. It takes a lot. It's vulnerable. You're vulnerable because you're expressing the desires of your heart, and also acknowledging that you're not there yet, but that, then all of a sudden then you have to some degree be a little bit more accountable.
Yeah.
Because people now know. But then if they do know, then they can watch the change happen. Like I remember when I started telling people I wanted to be a writer, then all of a sudden they started seeing some crappy blog posts go by, and really crappy blog posts on Facebook that I would share. And people aren't paying attention to you as closely as you think they are. All of a sudden, a year later, I'm coming out with a book called Willpower Doesn't Work. And they're like, whoa, I remember when you said you were going to do this a few years ago. I noticed those blog posts. You've been doing this for a while, Ben. That's cool. So it's really cool when you tell people about your journey, because then they can watch it unfold rather than just assuming you're still that same guy.
Totally. Will you do me a favor and just can you drop your mic and walk away?
Yeah, we're good, man. I just wanted to share that last thought.
I love it, man. What a gift. Thank you. Thanks for that. And just thanks for being here, Ben. Appreciate you tons, and good luck on the book launch, and stay safe and healthy out there.
It's a pleasure, man. Have a good one.